Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Brooks. It's great to be here with this incredible panel. Krystal Ball, of course, you know her from The Hill. The ever-brilliant Matt Karp of Jacobin and Princeton University. And you can check me out also on YouTube on The Michael Brooks Show. And I want to thank Verso Books for putting this together. I want to thank Fawn for doing all of the tech, which is always the hardest part of these things, without question. We're going to get started promptly, but I just want to let everybody know that you're encouraged to hang out after we're done, mingle, talk, go grab a copy of the new Jacobin, which is just hitting the streets, which we're very excited about. And if you can, and I didn't want to be the one to make this announcement because this is like a bad cop announcement, but if you can, fold your chairs. But I won't remind you, don't worry. That's other people going to remind you that shit. That's the last unfun thing I'll say. So I want to start, the name of this panel obviously is Who's Afraid of Bernie Sanders? And I guess my question is to both of you to get us started. To what extent are we talking about fear amongst just generally the media, the oligarchy, whatever? They're watching us. Illuminati.
That was me, I'm moving the mic, sorry.
Is that you?
Yeah, it's me. You got a subversive on the panel. He's trying to take us out.
We should fix that.
Is it cable?
So I'll probably go to Krystal first. To what extent are we talking about fear versus delusion in the sense that, of course, we're not afraid of Bernie. I mean, you see so many profiles that come out that say, like, well, we don't have to think about Bernie. Nobody is going to vote for him. And then how much of it is the willful omission dimension, you know, with the guys, Amy Klobuchar is not going to happen, right? So between fear, omission, and delusion, what would you say the response to Sanders is?
I'm so glad you asked it that way, because when I was thinking about this topic, by the way, hi guys, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you for Jacobin, thank you to Verso Books for putting this on. I'm glad you asked the question that way, because when I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about it in terms of actually delusion. You know, I think that there is so little, especially in the media and with the Democratic establishment, there's so little understanding and connectivity to the Sanders movement that they just can't believe that it's actually a threat. I mean, if you look at today, right, just have a new poll come out that has Bernie Sanders tied for first place. He's just overtaken Elizabeth Warren again for second place in the RCP average. New College Pulse poll shows him getting 51% support among young Hispanic college students. So there are a lot of signs, if they would look, that this movement is real. 4 million donations, are you kidding me? Massive rally crowds everywhere he goes. There are so many signs out there, but because it doesn't penetrate their particular circles, their particular bubbles, they can't believe that this is actually real. So I really think, you know, having worked in this world, when they're writing the articles and just sort of like leaving Bernie out of it, leaving him off the headlines, just completely ignoring him at the debate this week, he gets less time than Cory Booker. Like, what is that about, you know? Cory Booker who's begging the audience to keep him in the race, right? When they're doing this, I think it comes from a genuine place of just not getting this movement. Because what is this movement? This movement is young. It's working class, right? It's teachers, it's Walmart workers, it's people who are working at Amazon warehouses. These are the people that are funding and showing up at rallies and really energized and excited about this movement. And they just have no connectivity to those people at all. So I think it's more of delusion. Now, I actually, in my radar this morning, I tackled this a little bit. I think when, we'll say, Bernie wins either Iowa or New Hampshire, I think all of that ignoring him and not paying attention and not giving him a chance at all, I think then that all flips and there's a total meltdown, freak out when they realize, oh my God, this guy, like he could actually win. And then, oh my gosh, I mean, you see these like billionaires going on TV and crying about Elizabeth Warren. Can you imagine what's going to happen when they realize that Bernie Sanders could actually be the nominee, let alone the president? I can't even imagine the meltdown that's going to occur.
I can't.
But right now, I think we're in the delusion space.
Dying on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of my most favorite quotes of all time was delivered by Donald Trump, quoting Mahatma Gandhi, who never said this, but first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. We're still somewhere in the laughter and ignorance phase, I think, and just on Krystal's point, I think it's almost deeper than ignorance. There's the Bernie blackout, which you could say is a form of fighting, given the way that these. It's not a coincidence that multi-billion. It's elementary to fact that multi-billion-dollar media companies are not interested in promoting the candidacy of a socialist who's out to soak the wealth of multi-billionaire owners. But it's even beyond a certain kind of the ignorance of Bernie. It's a deep incomprehension, I think. It's on the level of, to the extent that these people, it's not that they aren't really thinking about Bernie. They are. They just don't understand. I think they look at Bernie as they still are in some ways, I would say this sort of in the mainstream press, are still in a kind of 2015 model of Bernie as this candidate of a kind of irrelevant fringe left. Okay, yes, college kids, young people like him. He is somehow sort of divorced and separate from real America, real politics. Where real politics happens is sort of somehow not compatible with Bernie Sanders. And it's a complete, completely blinkered worldview. But that's the sort of starting place, I think, for this analysis, where it's like, oh, let's take a few minutes to like consider this curiosity.
When you say real politics, I think of Chris Matthews with like a giant mouth of food. Real politics.
But I think it's entirely consistent with how the elite media covers anything that's happening with the working class. It's either completely ignored or it's caricatured. I mean, it's like, a CNN correspondent going on safari in their own country to see what the peasants are doing. I mean, that's the way that the working class is covered. Why? Because this is not the audience, and this gets back to Noam Chomsky. This gets back to thinking about media is a business. Who are their customers? It's affluent white liberals who love Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg, and that's why they get glowing coverage. That's why CNN goes down and Jeff Zeleny says, "Is Mayor Pete the next Obama?" Until they find some voter who's willing to be like, "Yes, of course he is." That's who their customer base is. That's who's buying New York Times subscriptions, Washington Post subscriptions. That's who their advertisers are pitching to. So it's no surprise that that's also who their stories are pitched to, geared towards. That's who they have in mind. And by the way, that's also who mostly populates newsrooms, right? So again, when we talk about lack of connectivity to this movement and the working class people that are fueling it and that it represents, it's so consistent with the failures of the media writ large that they cover Sanders' campaign, either not at all or with utter and complete derision and contempt.
I mean, all that data on occupational donors, people, like, to what extent there is something like an activated working class participating in politics today. It's through donating and volunteering to Bernie Sanders. I mean, the ratio between how many, like, say, mail carriers were Bernie Sanders donors compared to Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden donors, something like 5, 6, 7, 8 to 1. Truck drivers, forklift operators, et cetera. How many mail carriers end up on television ever, unless they're being the subject of an urban safari on the part of the New York Times? It just doesn't exist. So the sort of political worldview of a mail carrier who donates to Bernie is actually an undiscovered country for most of the media.
That's
Totally
100% right. And I want to bring in we've been having this conversation a lot because it's important, which is the PMC conversation, the managerial class, right? Because to what extent the dynamics you're talking about, there's like the really obvious raw disparity between, why would media that essentially represents, let's just say, 1% interests be giving a fair shot to a Democratic Socialist candidate? But then as part of that, like, I guess moving from the ignoring and the delusion, but the contempt and the anger, there is this in the same way that other candidates are fetishized because of degrees, I wonder if the fact that Bernie Sanders, even though he's a successful politician, that he really is like a dropout. I mean, this was made a lot more in the last cycle. There was a lot of like, this guy never did anything until he was mayor of Burlington and then in Congress and a senator. But besides that, he's a fucking loser, right?
He was a
Never
carpenter.
amounted
He
to
was a
anything.
carpenter
No.
and a bad carpenter.
And no, but I mean,
forgot about
no, but
that.
seriously, to what extent, suppose I would definitely hire him to be president, not hire him to be my carpenter.
That spoken
Yes,
word album,
yeah.
though, that was dope.
That was, of course, that's part of being president. But to what extent do you think that it's not just that this group of voters that has such a disproportionate influence, of course they're going to like Warren and Buttigieg, but that Sanders like fundamentally threatens everything that they have told themselves about who succeeds and why?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to tie this into the news of the week and what's going on with impeachment, et cetera, and Aaron Mate, who's in the room somewhere around here, made this point on the show this morning.
Aaron
Right over
Mate,
there.
prominent pro-impeachment activist.
So
Joking.
I'm just like shamelessly stealing Aaron's point. But, you know, a lot of what's going on with impeachment, you can really look through the lens of complete deniability from Democrats, complete inability to grapple with the real reason that Hillary Clinton lost, which is that no one wanted a centrist, corporatist, triangulating Goldman Sachs candidate. They didn't want that. And the Democratic establishment has never been able to grapple with that fact because it indicts everything they've been doing for the last 30 years, right? You have a lot of people, Nancy Pelosi, et cetera, who came to power through this particular system, this particular way of doing politics. So it does. They're not wrong. I mean, when Bernie Sanders says, I'm an existential threat to the Democratic Party, yes, I am, they are not wrong to feel that their occupation and base of power is truly threatened by a movement that centers working class people, the multiracial working class, and is bold and radical in its politics. So, you know, how many polls have come out that show Bernie beating Trump, especially in the states where we need to win most, right? Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, et cetera. How many polls have come out? And they will never talk about it because it just completely screws up their narrative of who's allowed to run and who is quote unquote electable. So you'll recall New York Times did these head-to-head matchups with Sanders and Warren and Biden. And Biden, you know, did well against Trump, Sanders did well against Trump, and Warren did less well. So rather than focusing on Sanders doing well, which, I mean, seems like a pretty remarkable headline that the guy that goes against all of their conventional wisdom about who can win and why is in fact beating Trump in these polls, they just completely ignored him and instead crafted this narrative about Warren's not doing well against Trump because she's too progressive. That's the problem. It's like, well, wait a second, you're kind of missing this thing that's happening here. But yeah, it is deeply threatening to the whole established way of business that the Democratic Party has been running for the past at least 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to put the media part aside for a minute and just talk about the party establishment side, the elected, sort of nomenclatura of the Democratic Party, there's no question that Bernie is a far deeper threat to them in some ways than he is to anyone, including and I almost wish this weren't so, but including the billionaire class, right now. I mean, I think long term, we'd hope that he would be a deeper threat to the billionaire class. But in the short term, Bernie is far more threatening to Pelosi-style politics in terms of what defines the left of center party in the United States. Than he is to the Republican Party, than he is, which will fight him as it has fought, a liberal centrist-dominated Democratic Party in different ways. And I hope we can get into the dynamics of what it would be like if Bernieism represented the main left of center party in the United States. But the group that loses most, and loses in a sense absolutely, and without a kind of recourse that the right or that even like the capitalist class would have against Bernie, is the Democratic Party insider. And I think that's something that, we would, this is, I've been saying this for a while, but the hardest part of the knot to cut through for Bernie is the primary, right? It's this moment. And Krystal you laid out his path today, and I like that narrative, but it's still the hardest part. I mean, if he gets through that hoop, and I hope we can talk about this, it's a different story. But there, not only is it structurally most difficult for him, in part because of the primary system, et cetera, but they are actually his most existential enemies, I think.
Yeah, it's like the early rounds at the U.S. Open. It's like the first people you got to get through before you even reach those higher levels of conflict. But let's go to how he actually wins in a minute. But first, can we talk more about impeachment and specifically how it just plays with this primary and with the Sanders proposition, like setting or how it's going to work politically specifically around Sanders? Does it undermine him? Is it a neutral variable or what?
I mean, I think you would have to say that it is bad for Democrats in general, but especially it's bad for progressives. It's bad for anyone who wants to say, look, Trump is a big problem, but we got bigger problems even beyond him. We can't just beat him. We need to address the underlying rot in this country that would have made voters put their trust in this dude to start with. So there's that. And then there's also just on the logistical side. I mean, look, they had this bombshell testimony this week. I thought, okay, great, we're going to wrap things up. We'll get to the vote. We'll get the articles. We'll do the trial. We'll get it wrapped up. And then I see this item in Politico that's like, no, they want to go back to the Mueller report, and they're going to try to get Don McGahn. And it's like, Jesus Christ. I mean,
well, I heard one ambassador called a research firm that was relayed to a second ambassador.
But he was in on that. He was in on that call.
There was
the
a
third
consulting
ambassador
shop
was in on that call, and there's a memo.
oh my
that
God.
came from Belarus
Well, that-
in
I mean, I didn't know
2014.
that. So that changes everything. No, I mean, look, and
Yeah.
I don't want to make light because, look, I don't think what Trump did was okay, right? I think it was an abuse of power, et cetera.
Of course.
But is this even close to the worst thing that this man has done? I mean, he locked babies in cages. We are currently complicit in the worst atrocity unfolding in the globe in Yemen. But when you go after Joe Biden's son for the sacrosanct principle of military aid to the Ukraine, that's where we draw the line. So that's, anyway, in terms of Bernie, just the reality of the fact that when you have a trial in the Senate, he has to be there 6 days a week in Washington during the height of the primary season. Well, who does this benefit? It benefits Pete Buttigieg and it benefits Joe Biden. And I don't think that Nancy Pelosi intentionally set this up this way, but I also don't think that she minds that too much. She's not a stupid person. She knows the timeline. She knows how this is all going to play out. She's got a lot of control over how this all plays out. Doesn't seem to concern her too much that this is all going to go right up to Iowa caucuses, New Hampshire primary, et cetera. So no, it's not a good situation for Bernie or Warren or any of the senators, but the only two that I think really matter are those two at this point.
I'll disagree there. I think it's a huge asset for Warren in that it'll afford a significant opportunity for her to remind the people of the United States that she read the entirety of the 480-page Mueller report, and also at least somewhere between 2 and 6 books about the history of Ukraine, an invented country. Okay, anyway.
I mean, that lands.
Whoa.
That shit
Okay,
lands
sorry,
in the
that was-
heartland.
Now you're escalating.
That
All countries are invented.
with
There you
focus
go.
groups in Michigan, that's the stuff right there.
That's the stuff. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not actually a hard liner on impeachment compared to maybe even some people on this panel or certainly
I'm
some
not.
people in the room.
Yeah.
But the truth is the way this
Impeach
was
the
built
motherfucker.
politically, this has always been political theater. That's everyone understands that, everyone should understand that the Senate is not going to crack and the Republican Party is not going to commit Harry-Carry and destroy its president right before an election. The odds of that happening, even as Democrats continue to sniff around, hoping, pressing their noses against the window until the cartilage breaks, trying to find the key piece of evidence that's going to
You
get...
stuck with that one.
Yeah, I stuck with that one.
He
The-
tested that out before,
That's
and we were like, dude, maybe rethink.
Yeah.
I was like, nope,
Yeah,
cartilage.
no, I like it rang true for you. You said you broke your nose many
did.
times. It's a very painful
It's
image.
painful.
But that's what they're doing.
nasty.
They're kind of.
Yeah.
I think there's a split between two factions that are pushing hard for impeachment. My read on this within the Democratic Party and the media. There's the idealists, if you want to call them that, sort of in the center, who really think that if they turn up the right phone call, if they bring in the right perfectly accented national security hero, that you're going going to get 20 Republicans in the Senate to crack and say, okay, this will not stand. But those people are obviously delusional in my mind. So the other argument for impeachment that I took more seriously was that this is going to be an opportunity to nail Trump and to nail the GOP on corruption, to kind of broaden the case against
and take
Trump.
up all their time.
Yeah, well-
That's the most compelling argument. I think.
That it's going to exactly.
It's
going
time maximization.
It's going to run out the clock on his administration. It's going to throw him into disorder. It's going to hurt his approval ratings. It's going to tank him slowly.
I don't know about hurt his approval ratings.
But that was the case, right? It was like Nixon. It's a slow deflation. That was what you have the everyday grind of these hearings, and everyone just sort of gradually becomes disillusioned with the president. The truth is, though, Trump is obviously in a very different position than Nixon. His political ratings are already in the toilet, and the people who are there for him are going to stay with him. So that's not happening. And more to the point, the way the hearings seem to have unfolded, there's no, as far as in fairness, I haven't been following it as closely as maybe some people, but I haven't. The polls don't seem to register a sense that the particular way that the Democrats have sort of shaped this theater, this performance of impeachment, has not connected it to broader questions about the state of the country and the larger corruption of the ruling class.
There's a new
centered on
Marquette
Trump.
poll showing that in Wisconsin, people are like actually moving back towards Trump to some extent.
No, I mean the same Emerson poll that had Bernie in first with Biden also showed independents moving against impeachment significantly, 10 points since last month. And it's because they feel like, okay, yeah, this wasn't okay, but is it impeachable? Is this really what we want Washington wrapped up in for months and months on end? This doesn't connect to my life. I care about healthcare, I care about wages, I care about climate change, I care about all these range of issues. And as much as we want to say, oh, they could walk and chew gum at the same time, of course they can. Of course the media can. I mean, of course they're going to be wall-to-wall coverage on this. It's at least good for ratings. It hasn't been as great for ratings as they'd hoped, but it's good for ratings. And their whole mission, since Trump has been in office, is to make every story about how Trump is bad, which has only really helped Trump, honestly.
I mean, I think Bernie's got the right take on it with the walk and chew gum line right now. I think he's got to support this process because it is something that overwhelming majority of Democratic. I mean, that's the other irony here, is that it's like politically for Bernie right now, like this is a huge issue for the part of the Democratic base that's paying attention, and it's not an issue that really helps him, but he can't fight it. He has to support it.
Yeah.
It just kind of, and if this drags on until the spring, I don't like the position that it puts him in terms of the delicate line he's got to walk to recenter his issues, when they seem to be committed. The congressional leaders seem to be committed to this like narrow brand of impeachment, not broader corruption, bribery, blah blah blah, but focused like a laser on like the Ukrainian security funding.
He should grandstand as much as possible, but on it. But I mean, how does he win?
But that's not it.
This
that's
is depressing.
Not
Let's not talk about
what he does.
impeachment anymore. It's depressing.
Yeah, but I heard that there was an ambassador, who was a retired consultant, who had taken a trip to the Black Sea in 2000. Sorry, I can write this.
There's a real estate investment.
Yeah, and there was a real estate investment in southern Russia.
But seriously, what if he was a Russian asset since 1972? I mean, have you thought about that?
I know. Yeah, the KGB went to the Burlington Food Co-op, and they were like, by the time late-stage capitalism has decimated the American living standard so much, a senior citizen Jew will be in position.
You've seen those honeymoon videos, right? Shirtless. Just loving it, just absolutely Sovietized,
having a fantastic time. Yeah. So, but I think though it's actually really important to keep it real, which is like he is a main contender, and arguably, just objectively, I mean, I think Biden is a disaster. Obviously, I think Biden, unless he's in complete physical cognitive decline, which he is, would be a strong opponent against Donald Trump. Like, I don't think it's all ideological. Some of it is stylistic, some of it.
Yes.
And Bernie Sanders is actually really, really well poised to beat Trump for a variety of reasons. And I want you to sketch out exactly how that happens. But first, I want to just circle back on an interesting polling data that I've seen at least in one or two places, which they will try to use against him, I'm sure, which is that some Democratic voters that rate themselves as conservative support him quite a bit. And I think that's really interesting because obviously he has the most left program, and that is across the board, right? The best approach on immigration, clear positions on civil rights and equity issues. But at the same time, I think what is maybe, this is just my theory, I think what's resonating with people is the way that word is used by normal people, which is some respect for community, some respect for values outside of success and competition, and things like that. So and I think that also really helps him in a general election to speak credibly against Trump as like an actual bearer of decency, not just like hysterical, how dare you, sir stuff.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, look, in a lot of ways, we at Rising get to sort of see how that crossover between the left and independents and more moderate and conservative Democrats and even some Republicans, how that works. You've got 70% of the public, 70%, who say, screw all these people, who have a deep rage and anger at the Democratic establishment, the Republican establishment, at all of DC. And so when you have Bernie Sanders out there willing to call BS on the Democratic establishment, that lands with a lot of people, and it's not a left-right thing. I mean, we were digging into some of the crosstabs, and maybe some of you all saw this, in New Hampshire, which is an open primary, and the three candidates who have the most crossover Trump voter support are Tulsi Gabbard, Bernie Sanders, and Andrew Yang. Why?
Right.
Because all three of them are anti-establishment. They're very different ideologically. They're very different candidates stylistically, ideologically, et cetera. The one common thread is that they are willing to call bullshit on the Democratic establishment. They are not of the Democratic establishment. And that there is a massive constituency for people who are just willing to be honest about the failures of power, whether it's on the left or whether it's on the right. And so I really don't think it's more complicated than that. I also do think, and I worked in West Virginia. I used to live in Kentucky. I was at Bernie's rally in Kentucky, so I got to see him in action there. And there's such a lack of understanding of how those issues around labor, around union rights, healthcare. I mean, you could almost not be on economic issues. It would be hard to be too far left on economic issues to land in most of the country. And so the fact that he leads with that and it connects in this very just like real and visceral emotional way. His language isn't, it's not the overly intellectual way. It doesn't come off as Harvard. It comes off as I'm meeting you where you are. I'm hearing you. I'm addressing your concerns, and I'm going to fight for you. It's incredibly powerful. But yeah, I think, the reason why I think he would be the best candidate to go up against Trump is because of that anti-establishment branding, the fact that he speaks about populist economic issues in such a powerful and accessible way. And also because no one's going to be able to accuse him of being corrupt, right, or being corporate owned, or any of the things that that Hillary walked right into, that Biden is an absolutely easy mark for. Like,
never will I cheat on you, as Travis Scott sings. Yeah,
indeed.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you can just with Biden, you could just roll out the same playbook that he used against Hillary Clinton. It's not going to work with Bernie. And for all the oh my God, they're going to call him a socialist. Well, first of all, they're going to call all these people socialists, number one. Number two, let them, and then let's have a debate about economics, because that is the place where we actually are strongest in places across the country.
I mean, it's such a critical moment. We're poised at this knife edge here where this, an old order is dying, a new world has yet to be born, et cetera. I mean, we've been that way for a minute, actually, since 2008. And partly this issue to sort of promote what I think is really critical reading in this moment that explores both the opportunities and in some serious, very sober-minded ways that are sort of anathema to my own boosterism, explores the ways in which the limits of left populism in Europe, in South America, and elsewhere, and takes a hard look. A lot of the pieces in this issue about, clearly the center has fallen out of transatlantic politics in so many ways, and the populist right's on the march. Populist left is fritzing in and out, but looks to have a look in the United States, which I'm going to come back to. But I think what we've got good pieces on the pink tide in South America, what it achieved and what it didn't achieve, which we see very vividly these days. And I'm not hijacking to Bolivia, but it's something that we need to wrestle with on the left. There's a good piece, kind of an amazing interview with Yasha Monk in there, a very hostile interview, which is good, about the promise and perils of populism. This is a critical moment where I actually do think I'm bullish on populism. I'm bullish on sort of the analysis that Krystal just gave about in the United States in particular where people are and how Bernie meets that need. There are long-term issues about how the possibilities and the limits of that, right. Which I think this is what Jacobin is for in some ways, to sort of get into the meat of those issues. But to stay on 2016 and bring it back home. I was looking at, we're doing crosstabs. I love crosstabs. I promise people some crosstabs. I was looking at the Survey USA Georgia poll, and they, there's always a percentage of Democrats that they poll who voted for Trump, right? It's like, 6-7%, right? It's those Obama-Trump voters, right? Georgia, this was interesting. It's like about 6%, but it was a huge sample size, so there were over 100 people. Bernie led. He like clean lead of Trump voting Democrats in this poll. I mean, again, not surprising if we're gonna, from Krystal's analysis is clear, like that he's the outsider candidate. But I still think like that is missing from our sense. It was like he was up on Biden. Warren had, I think it was of the Trump voters, and this is ominous for me if you're thinking about Warren in the 2020 election. We can talk about electability. I think it was. They had Bloomberg in the race, and it was Bernie. Bernie was at something like 20%. Bernie was at 26%. Biden was at 17%. Bloomberg was at 13%. Warren had 0. Zero of the Trump voters were going to be compelled to return to the Democratic fold with
She's
Warren.
not going to bring me back.
I mean, that's Georgia. That's one state. It's one poll. But I think there's a lot of that was just a really radical distillation of that for me.
And there's been this debate that I personally think has been kind of stupid of like, how should Democrats go about winning? Are you going to flip back the Obama-Trump voters, or are you going to try to expand the electorate and turn out young people, turn out people of color, as if these are either or propositions? And I think what Sanders shows is the possibility of doing both. Right? That these don't have to be either or possibilities.
That's actually his coalition. It is both.
It
that is
literally
exactly who
right.
likes Bernie.
Exactly.
There's a problem in, this goes back to the media narrative, because of course it's both, and of course it is actually an Obama thing. It is literally both and, right?
Yeah.
But if you go, and I was just talking about this with Adolph Reed, who I know was also just on the Hill, and if everybody would just read Adolph Reed, I think we'd be in a better position. But seriously. But we were talking about the replication, actually, of these narratives that in the 90s were deployed in such a racist and specifically reactionary way by obviously Republicans, but also Clinton Democrats, which is just pathologizing poverty, racializing it in the most obscene ways, and culminating in the attacks on welfare and so on. Right now, in 2019, there is a like woke reactionary discourse which takes the same narrative structure and turns it on those voters that might have voted for Trump. Now again, no one's denying, obviously there's a ton of white identity politics and racism in the electorate, and that's a major problem, and by the way, it's always been a major problem. This is not specific to Trump. He might have activated it in different ways. But you will get to a point now, it was one thing when people would say, don't worry about flipping those voters back, they're gone. Okay, I disagree with that, but sure, we can argue about that. Now it's almost like to even appeal to them
right.
on the correct grounds,
yeah.
Economics, not ceding an inch on the things that you need to hold ethical grounds on, like immigration, but just saying, we're not gonna cede on any of those things, but we're gonna talk about an actual no bullshit anti-corporate agenda. That has become suspect because books like Dying of Whiteness and all of this, not like, people are not dying of whiteness, they're dying of opioids. Right. This is not poetry, this is real material conditions. Right. And that discourse has been so perverted that it's an attack not only against Sanders, but actually all of us that are trying to build that left populist socialist coalition.
It's so damaging. I mean, it's so damaging on so many levels. Because also to imagine as a party that you're going to stand in judgment of voters like, oh, you're good enough for us, but you yes, we're going to go. I mean, it's just like, I didn't sign up to be part of any part of that. And I saw it, I was living in Kentucky during the 2016 election, which was a very fascinating experience, kind of splitting my time between Kentucky and like New York City cable news green rooms was interesting. But, you know, I would post things about the politics there and what was going on. And they had just, people don't realize this given how red the state is. Obviously, they just elected a Democratic governor. But before that, I mean, they had just lost control of the House to Republicans. They had just elected a Republican governor for the first time in a very long time. And so they, you know, right to work was getting passed and prevailing wage was being stripped. I mean, all these, there's a tax on teachers and pensions and every like piece of terrible right-wing legislation you can imagine is just getting shoved through. And so I would put things out on social media about it. And I couldn't believe how many people wrote back like, well, screw them. They're racist. They get what they deserve. They asked for it. They voted for Trump, et cetera.
I heard someone say after the election, I think the problem is that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are so honest that they wouldn't lie and tell these people that they were going to get jobs back. And so the real question that this person had was whether or not the next Democratic nominee should lie more effectively to deindustrialize America.
Wow.
Or just ignore them.
Deep question.
I mean, it's hilarious and really disgusting.
It's incredibly disturbing and it's incredibly damaging, and you see how absurd it becomes. And I think this goes back to the inability to admit why Hillary actually lost, right? It has to be Russia, or it has to be Comey, or it has to be, you know, media coverage of her emails, or it has to be the voters, they're too stupid, they're too racist, it has to be their fault. It can't be anything to do with the sort of centrist corporatist agenda, because that undermines everything that they've been doing for decades now. So they had to scapegoat voters or somebody else. And again, to your point, Michael, it's not to say that there is nothing going on. Of course there is. But again, this conversation of was it economic interest or was it racism, as if those two things are completely divorced and don't relate to one another. But you see the absurdity of it when you now get to Kamala Harris basically blaming voters in the Democratic primary, saying they're too racist and sexist to vote for her. So now it's not just the Republican voters who are suspect. Apparently it's also the Democratic primary voters who are suspect and failing to see Kamala's greatness because of their own inherent sexism and racism, and that's why she's failing. Now, you know, I don't know about you, but I remember when she was up a lot higher in the polls, so I guess America's become a lot more sexist and racist since that unfolded.
I would just like to take a quick note here that if you have not subscribed to my Patreon or YouTube page yet, there's a shocking level of half anti-Semitism you're expressing. And it's disgusting. All right, half
anti-Semitism.
Yeah, it's super deep.
I mean, I think one way to translate what you guys are saying is we always talk about Bernie and the class politics that Bernie can activate and mobilize, and I hope we will talk about that in the general election. But this is a class politics too, right? Class politics doesn't go just one way, right? It goes down much more easily than it goes up in the course of human history. And this is there's the right wing kind of business class politics, and then there's a kind of a liberal establishment class politics that exists. I mean, Dustin Guastella's article in the issue tackles some of this. I've written about this. This is a conscious form of polarizing politics. I mean, because it's absurd as an electoral strategy if you're aiming to win a majority. And actually, some people in the Democratic matrix are aware of this, right? They'll say, you know, some of the kind of almost like totally bloodless, like let's just get to 52% kind of folks will, like the Nate Cohns of the world, will kind of acknowledge this sometimes, that you actually do need to win these voters. But it's crazy to say, and this is the historian 19th century self coming out, but imagine if Lincoln's running for president in 1860, right? And the Republicans, an anti-slavery party, is going door to door in a state like Pennsylvania or Illinois and saying, the swing states of that era and saying, you voted for James Buchanan, he was a tool of a slaveholder, stay home, please, we don't want your vote. Like, this is ridiculous, you know? We need to build the route to overcoming reaction and racism in this country is building a majority to defeat it and destroy it, not to demonize someone who themselves is probably, in many cases, are struggling materially enormously, not to demonize them, but to enlist them in this fight in some way.
What is the obsession in the Democratic Party and in liberalism generally that contradicts it between just sort of like proclamation and sort of moral hectoring versus actual material delivery? Because I think that's something that comes up so often in this argument. And actually, really, to me, I mean, you could maybe connect this with how he actually wins the primary.
Yeah, I don't know if I can do that. That sounds like a lot. But let
You
me
could
start
do
with
it.
this.
You could do it. I have confidence in you.
Let me start with this. I mean, I think what we have seen in an era where politics are so gridlocked that so little gets accomplished, the only thing that either side can deliver for their bases is basically this sort of like culture war, like psychological benefit. And you see it really plainly with Trump. Right. I mean, you see it really plainly, the white identity politics and the, you know, that his base is still so with him because at least they can get juice out of that. But you see it with Democrats, too. I mean, they feel like they can do the same, like, sell out the working class thing as long as they're less racist than the Republicans to keep people of color, working class people of color in the fold. And so it's incredibly cynical, honestly. But in an era where you have gridlock politics, there's a sense that that's the only thing that you can deliver on. So it all collapses down to this kind of virtue signaling, very shallow level of politics.
Yeah. Can we talk Bernie Trump 2020 and how
Can we-
how do we break this box?
How do we actually win?
Yeah.
But first, let's
We
get
talk
through
about the primary.
Let's talk. We got to do the primary
all right.
first.
And I agree with you. I
Yes.
think the primary is harder.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So you're right. We should
primary-
talk more about. I want to talk about the easy part. Come on.
We'll get to
Easy stuff is fun.
Look, so easy part you, hard part you. How does
Okay.
he win the primary?
Okay. Yeah.
How does he win the primary?
Yeah.
I mean, I think here's what I would say, and it's worth thinking about this too. You know, in the same way that Bernie's working class coalition is really ignored, treated with contempt, et cetera, by the media. Media doesn't love Joe Biden either, and so I think it's very much because he also has a working class base, tends to be an older base. It tends to be, you know, less online, all of those things. But his people really are there, and they really are with him. They may not be showing up at rallies. There may not be the visible energy, but there is a real Joe Biden support out there, much as it is hard for me to kind of wrap my head around. So I just want to put out there, and I said this week on Rising, that I think the chance of Biden getting the nomination is much higher than is typically portrayed in the media. You know, if you look at where the polls are and where they've been, he's been, regardless of, you know, not knowing what state he's in and talking about record players and corn pop and whatever else is like tumbling and how he's going to punch domestic violence. I mean, all of this, right, is happening. And he's just like
You gotta deport xenophobia.
he's still
We will lynch
right
racism.
there. He's still right there in the polls. I mean, none of it really moves because people and I kind of get it because at least he doesn't feel like he's full of shit. You know, I think he sincerely believes that his like incrementalist, neoliberal, let's just get rid of this guy and go back to the good old days thing. Like, I think he sincerely believes
I thought you were going to go
that.
in another direction. Like he's sincerely declining.
Yeah, well, that I mean
No lie.
that too. But I think he's sincere. So I just want to say I don't want you to think that it's not possible that Biden will win this nomination. It's
Right.
very possible. I think if the voting started today, Biden would be the nominee. Because if you look at, he's in strong enough position in Iowa and New Hampshire. I don't think you're going to have a clear, like, one person who wins both and comes in with a full head of steam. So if he does fine in Iowa and New Hampshire, comes into South Carolina and Nevada. He will win South Carolina, I think, almost no matter what happens. And then you're into Super Tuesday, and you have a lot of southern states with large, sizable African-American populations that are going to vote on Super Tuesday. You're talking about, North Carolina, you're talking about Virginia, you're talking about Oklahoma, you're talking about Tennessee, you're talking about Georgia. I mean, there's a lot, and Texas, which is a place where Biden, I looked at the RCP average, has right now a 10-point lead there on Bernie. So he has real strength. So something does need to shake up. Now, I will say, I do think that it is entirely reasonable and not a conspiracy theory to think that Bernie's coalition is undersampled in these polls. I don't think that that's crazy to think at all, in part because his whole theory of the case is expanding the electorate. So definitionally, pollsters are going to screen out of their likely voter model the people that Bernie is trying to bring into the fold and get to show up that have never showed up before or show up very irregularly. So I don't think that's crazy at all, but that accounts for a few points. It doesn't account for the 10-point disparity that you see right now in the RCP average. Look, I think strategically, as we get closer down to the wire, I think he's got to be more aggressive, more direct in making the contrast, in calling out the corruption, in really separating himself. Elizabeth Warren did him a big favor with her Medicare for All flip-flop and walking away from that and now basically being on the Pete train on Medicare for All. That helps a lot in terms of separating from her. But ultimately, it's really Biden's base that Bernie needs to cut into. And there's so much to work with there. I mean, Biden is the architect of so much of what is wrong with the country, of the bad trade deals, of the deregulating Wall Street, of the selling, of the shipping jobs overseas, of the system of mass incarceration, which somehow his son apparently gets to be exempt from.
How
even
about the
as
bankruptcy bill?
I mean,
how are we
yes.
not talking about that?
There's so much, there's a lot to work, and so I think.
Guy's been wrong his whole life. That's
His
like
whole
his job.
life.
Yeah.
And Trump is what we've gotten from him, right? And Trump being the symptom of this deep rot of consumerism and lost sort of faith and belief in the future and community and what matters. So he's got to go at that directly. And if you can do that, look, I think he needs to win one of Iowa or New Hampshire just to flip that media narrative of like, oh my God, this guy can win, and convince the public, oh my God, this guy can win. And then you've got a lot of strength. He has a lot of potential strength on Super Tuesday in California and Texas, two huge states, massive delegate counts that I think he's got 40 organizers on the ground in California. The next closest candidate is Warren with 9. So he's got a huge jump in his eye on California, and that's going to be a big key for him.
It's a very different strategy than in 2016 when he was sort of running from so far behind the whole time. He had to dump everything into those first 4, especially those first 2 states. He is building out. It's actually somebody like Buttigieg is doing that strategy now and is going to flame out because of it. I've become convinced, just even like preparing for this show, that because this is a show, right? We're on TV. This is like my fantasy to be on Rising.
You have been on Rising.
Yeah, I know. But that Biden is the real. Biden is still, at the end of the day, it's still Biden is still the threat. And the good news is, because just on this morning's Rising, Saagar was knocking Bernie for failing to expand the base. And that's fair, but I was looking at, did you see some of those polls that came out on this like sort of, I think it's a post-Obama tech bro kind of group called Swayable or something like that. Okay. And they put out a bunch of polls where they winnow the field. They kind of play the tape forward based on preferential polling. They aggregate like second choice polling, et cetera. And they try to figure out, okay, what would it look like if this is assuming that this will happen, maybe somebody like Andrew Yang will run the entire primary. I mean, personally, I hope not. I hope he, I hope he passes the torch.
I hope he starts a podcast.
Yeah, but if the race came down to 2 or 3 people, and so if you just look at the Bernie Biden numbers, in June, Biden was up 15 points when the race kind of really began in earnest. That number is down to 8 now. So Bernie is slowly, I think it's more about Biden deflating than Bernie aggregating, but that is happening, and it's especially happening if you look at non-white voters. Biden was up 9, now he's up 4. So Bernie has really made headway into black voters, and particularly though into Latino voters, as we talked about. And I think he is slowly expanding the base. That might not be fast enough. The trajectory might need to accelerate. But
Well-
there is some reason for hope that he's doing some of that work.
I'll tell you the two groups that the campaign told me they're looking very closely at and you see this already playing out. And one is with Latinos, and they've been doing that work so effectively. I mean, he really has a great team in place that is understanding that community. I mean, it is of that community and speaking to them in a way that connects and is culturally relevant. The other group that we've talked less about is white working class women. They see as a real potential growth area, not just young, but across generations. And if you put those two pieces together, yeah, I think he's really well positioned.
So you think Warren has helped everything by this ridiculous like Rube Goldberg thing with healthcare.
Yeah.
And that's clarified. I mean, the argument about him and Warren is relevant like in these rooms, not probably with the broader like there's more overlap in the broader electorate between a Biden and a Sanders voter potentially. So I mean, if you guys have more to say about the primary, I mean, I think that's
polls
really
seem to show
clear.
that poll was interesting. It showed Warren voters sort of splitting between Biden and Bernie, which is
Right.
not what you would think if you're doing
No,
a
that
pure
isn't what you would
ideological
think.
move. But that makes some sense to me. I mean, the thing with Warren is I think obviously she has a path to the nomination too. You know, Krystal has laid it out. But I think I don't know. This is anecdotal. This is gut. But I was talking. I live in Warren world. You know, pretty much all my friends offline are Warren people. And I was talking with one of them last weekend, and he was like, "Oh, I'm in for." Of course, because I'm a lovely party guest. The first question I ask, or the third, is, "Well, who are you voting for?" Even though I know the answer, but it's never Bernie with a lot of these people. Yeah. But so they say Warren. But this guy leaned in close as we had a few more drinks. He was like, "You know what, though? I don't know if she can win." And I want
That's a good sign.
I want to beat Trump. I want to beat Trump. And that's the thing that actually I care about the most. That's the thing that not just Warren voters care about the most. That's the thing that Biden voters care about the most. That's the thing that a lot of Bernie voters care about the most. Yeah. And I think Warren, for good reasons and for bad reasons, you know, we have to put it on the table. There absolutely gendered logic to this. But this guy said to me, you know what, if it came down to Bernie and Warren, I think I might go Bernie because I think he has a better chance. And I think this is backed up in the data that shows, you know, Warren voters they're shopping, they're not buying yet. And and I think the failure to make the sale is about this electability question. Yeah. Can Warren stand up against Trump in a general?
But you know what's crazy is a lot of the people who are concerned about Warren from an electability perspective are going to Pete, which I'm like, this guy, like, that's not like, I mean, it just again shows you how much it has been beaten into our heads that you have to have a centrist to win. And so they look at, well, Warren, she's too far left. Let me go for Pete. I mean, he's speaking the same like wine track kind of language. And it's really kind of, it's fascinating because his rise has definitely come at her expense. There's just no doubt about it. But yeah, a lot of the people who have electability concerns about Warren are actually going to Pete.
Which is disturbing because that puts like as a Bernie homer to ride or die to the grave. That puts us in a position where I'm kind of like, my mind is saying this is good. This Mayor Pete, high hopes for Pete to take away Warren's vote in Iowa. I'm not doing the dance. I promise. I will never do the dance. I will never do the dance. I will never. What's the third one? Yeah. I will never do the Pete dance. Right. But actually,
that's us when he takes her margin in Iowa. This is Matt and I on Iowa night when exactly. Bernie has won.
Bernie emerges as the left candidate out of Iowa, or as the change candidate out of Iowa.
Because Pete takes
the anti-billionaire candidate out of Iowa.
So, all right. So,
can I throw one more thing in?
You can.
Last thought. This just occurred to me. Bloomberg is going up with this $30 million ad buy that no one wanted or asked for, and I'm sure there's nothing better that could be done with that money. However, you know, it is reasonable to think that he could take a little bit out of Biden, and it's also reasonable to think he could take a little bit out of Warren. As weird as that is ideologically, but there is overlap there. So, you know, Bloomberg getting into look, you know, 0% of Bernie supporters are going to go to Michael Bloomberg. So it only benefits him. And to the point Matt made about commitment of supporters, this is from that same Emerson poll that had Bernie tied with Biden. Bernie supporters, 71% say they are definitely voting for him. Biden supporters, 60%. Warren, I think it was 47%, and Pete, it was 31%. So when you're talking about that shopping around, that shows
We're
it
not
right
shopping.
Yeah, we're not shopping here.
Yeah.
We don't believe in consumption.
We don't, right, exactly. We don't believe in choice.
It's command economy, right here.
All right, stop streaming it. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. When we take power. No,
Can we talk? Can I give my little?
Yes.
Go into the
Krystal,
general.
can you say, Matt? Can you have your what's your take on the news?
Matt, what's on your radar?
Yeah. I want my little window right here. Here's my thing. Okay, a general election. If we're going to talk about if Bernie can
Do it.
can thread this needle, all right? If he can do it.
Do it.
This is the semis, right? This is the finals at the U.S. Open.
Right,
It's a
that's what I
totally different
said
ballgame.
before, yes.
It's on a scale that we still don't realize, because anyone who's here, anyone who's on Facebook, we're political junkies. We're ill. We're sick. We don't represent anyone.
That's
we
right.
don't.
It's super
You know how many
unhealthy.
people voted in the Democratic primary in
Go play
2016, which was everybody here probably gave their nights and their days and their nights to this thing. Do you know how many people voted in that primary? 30 million people. Do you know how many people voted in the general election? 120 million more. So we're talking on a scale of 4. If you can imagine the noise around an election that we had with Bernie Hillary, the clarity of that contrast, which was not enough to win Democratic primary voters, but consistently put Bernie as the most popular politician in the country, that entire race. The noise around that election, if you imagine that, and Bernie's now not going against Hillary in a Democratic Party, he's going against Donald Trump in a general election, where we actually haven't begun to fathom the scale of this like naked class war that I think will emerge in this election. I mean, 3 things. Here are my 3 things, all right? We're going to go through this, all right? 1, compared to 2016, right? Okay, I said I wasn't going to do that. I'll be quick. Compared to
Take your
2016,
time. Luxuriate.
compared to 2016, that election was we have a general election between 2 parties where you really have to choose. But we can, if you guys want to talk about what Bloomberg will do in this scenario, that's fine.
No.
It's not going to happen though. It's not going to happen.
no.
There will be two legitimate candidates in this election who have a chance to win. And if it's Bernie and Trump, we're going to see an election that in 2016 was a culture war election, right? We're going to see an election that went from morals and manners to money and power. Bernie is going to put the bread and butter on the table. He's going to talk about healthcare. He's going to talk about jobs, the job guarantee, and he's not just going to talk about jobs in the way politicians talk about it. He's going to say, no, I guarantee you a job. It'll be really interesting to see which
Can you do an
issues in the
impression,
Bernie
Matt?
mix. No, I can't do it.
All right.
In the Bernie mix come out. He's got so many things to pluck on. He hasn't hit the job guarantee very hard in this primary. I think that comes out of the wagon big time in a general election in a way that Democrats used to talk about full employment all the time and win on it. And he can do that. And okay, bread and butter. That's the first thing. Second thing, Bernie versus the billionaire, right? Trump. Democrats are congenitally, materially incapable of attacking Trump as a symbol of a corrupt order.
Can you imagine the contrast between that versus he's not a real billionaire?
Yeah, exactly.
Hillary Clinton
Yeah.
literally said, I'm proud to have the real people that have fucked you over supporting me. Versus a guy who maybe has provided you a little bit of television
Warren
entertainment.
Buffett, all the billionaires were supporting Hillary Clinton. Warren
Yes.
Buffett, Mark Cuban, Michael Bloomberg was at the dang convention. Okay, so they can't attack him for being a billionaire. Even when they attack him for being rich, it's like, okay, you're a individually freakish, corrupt mafia don who has no relationship to the American economy that's based on financialization and real estate, profit exploitation over the last 20 years. It just is a coincidence that Donald Trump became rich. Bernie gets to put not just Trump on stage, he gets to put Trump as the emblem, as the actually the most depraved and disgusting, physically repulsive emblem of the billionaire class on trial. He does. And in a way that Hillary could never do, would never do, and none of the other Democrats, I think Elizabeth Warren included, will never do. Second thing. Okay. Yeah. Okay, third.
Get amped.
Third point, let's get a little check mark. Gloves off, okay? Gloves off. We don't know the real Bernie. We don't know the real gloves off Bernie. We've only seen Bernie on the national stage in a Democratic
You see the
primary.
way he's
With
learning
his
it.
friends, right?
With his friends.
Yeah.
Secretary Clinton. I have respectfully disagree. Okay, sorry. I said I can't do it. I'm not
No,
going to
you
try to
did
do
it.
it.
You know what? I have to tell you what I saw. Did you guys see the impression video
my God.
with James
Yeah,
Adomian?
that was great.
So what I really loved at that, James Adomian in character said that Trump looks like Chucky. And what I wanted to see how Bernie would respond, and Bernie sat there, and Bernie's like, yeah, particularly when he smiles. There it is.
Yeah.
When he tries to smile, he didn't even give him a smile.
Exactly, we don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
Bernie attacks Trump rhetorically. He does the thing that all the Democrats do, but we don't know what it's like when Trump is in his sights. When he has somebody in his sights who's not. Look, the blood sport doesn't play well in a Democratic primary, and I agree that he needs to differentiate himself from Warren more and so on, and that will happen. But even when he does that, it's going to have to be very subtle. Iowa caucus voters don't want to see chum in the water.
I think
it's
you're
tricky.
wrong.
Oh, you
I
think you're wrong?
think they do.
Wow.
I mean, like, they say they don't.
Oh,
but
I like it.
They
TikTok.
Krystal's harder than me on this. Okay, fine. But Bernie so far at least seems to have taken my view that it's better not to go on attack. But that being aside, your damn emails, I don't want to hear about them, etc. But in a general, we don't know. Gloves off Bernie is a different Bernie. There's a tiny preview of this in I'm sure it's not representative, but anyone remember Bernie's first Senate campaign? Real Bernie heads here against Richie Rich Tarrant, Republican software developer from Vermont, almost a billionaire, who ran in 2006. And remember, this was a Republican-held seat. Jim Jeffords had won the Republican primary in 2000 in a landslide. He was a centrist Republican. He switched parties, but he was a Republican. He won 40% of the vote. This was a real possible opportunity in 2006. Tarrant spent more money than anyone's ever spent in a Vermont Senate election, I think still probably to this date. Bernie called him out as Richie Rich every day. He talked about his Florida real estate, luxurious real estate
amazing.
holdings. He nailed him to the wall on him trying to buy the election. It was beautiful class politics, and he won going away. He won by something like 30-some points. It was beautiful, and we don't even know Trump's vulnerabilities from this perspective yet, because we haven't even gotten a chance to put him in the crosshairs yet.
Excellently done. I want to say, I'm going to tell Saagar we've got a new co-host, new backup co-host. And also we need a live studio audience too, I think.
Yeah.
How does that win in the general election? Because we always say, and the other big difference is that Bernie's going to be an organizer, and it's going to flow right into how he pushes his agenda. But what does that actually look like when the rubber hits the road, right? Because this is a really unique proposition. He's got to get through this primary process. Then he needs to make jokes about Trump wanting to get with his daughter and do all the great stuff that we hope he will do. Yeah, I've been hoping on that myself. Then he needs to become president, and immediately, even in his transition period will be totally different.
Yeah.
It won't be staffing. Obviously it will be staffing, but it will be like, how am I going to continue this mobilization that is going to actually be even more difficult than winning an election?
It gets
how
hard
does
again.
that process
I think
happen?
that's right.
And particularly with the context of, Matt's all about the stealth class consciousness raising of all of this. So what's the bigger effect?
Well, for one, to plug a Jacobin issue a couple issues back, we had, what could Bernie do? There are certain, I think basically the class, I'd like to hear Krystal on this, but basically the class war continues. I think the campaign doesn't end. I mean, it is hard because you're fighting. Bernie in office is a lot harder than the general election campaign. I believe the general election campaign is the easiest and the most pleasurable part of this. It's terrifying, the thought of him losing. I won't put that aside, but I think this is the easiest part. Governing is like the primary. It's hard again. But I think the starting point is the campaign continues. Every governing office act is also a political act that is continuing the campaign. Yeah. But I would like to hear Krystal say.
What happens when the bureaucracy is up against them?
Yeah, I think there are some warnings for Sanders in the experience of the Trump presidency in terms of how he would actually govern. Saagar on my show actually talks about this a lot, and it's something that he saw unfold as someone who supports Donald Trump. And basically, Trump comes into office with this sort of heterodox set of views and no infrastructure, no people to actually implement and execute on that policy. And he's a mess, and he's incompetent, and he's all over the place. So he certainly has no idea how to do it on his own or how to assemble a group of people who can back him up. So he brings in frickin' Sean Spicer and Reince Priebus and Mnuchin and Gary Cohn, and these people have
clown car.
Zero interest
Inspiring,
in the sort of trade policy that Trump is interested in. They have zero interest, thank God, in the immigration policy that he's interested in. And And it's not just that ring of advisors either. When you're staffing an administration, you're not just talking about the top 5 or even 10 people. You're talking about like 1,000 people that need to come in to take over this bureaucracy, because otherwise, in a million little ways, you will be undermined at every turn. Now, what I will say is I think there is a lot more infrastructure on the left to come in and take those positions, but don't doubt that there is a powerful establishment bureaucracy in place that, if Bernie Sanders is president, will fight him at every turn, will not want to upend the established way of doing business. And you'll still have a lot of Democrats in the House and Senate who also don't want to undermine him at every turn in every way that they can. So having the people around him who are willing to play brass knuckles within the federal bureaucracy, know how to work those levers of power, and are fundamentally committed to a Sanders both domestic and foreign agenda. I mean, that's one of the other things that we've really seen too, is the way that the sort of military-industrial complex fights back if you want to do anything different on foreign policy at all. I mean, we will see that writ large in a Trump administration, in a Sanders administration as well. So that's the warning. But I think, assuming, look, Bernie Sanders is a million times smarter and more competent than Donald Trump. There's a lot more infrastructure on the left, so let's assume he's able to build that piece out much more effectively than this administration has done. Then I think, his model, what he's talked about, is the only way that you can go about doing it. And I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that it's like, straightforward and we're going to do this and then bingo, we're going to have Medicare for all. But you literally do, like he said, have to go to Joe Manchin's backyard, like with all of us and all of our friends, all the working class people who are going to benefit from Medicare for all. You have to show up and demand it. It is the only way that dramatic change has ever happened in this country. It doesn't come from the halls of Washington, I can tell you that much. So I will say, and maybe this is fanciful, but I think in a world where Bernie Sanders becomes president, there will be such a shock to the establishment that they will be doing some searching of like, oh my God, where do we go from? What do we do?
Mike Bloomberg will not be self-searching if that
there will be an opening there politically as well. Like, oh my God, this movement is something that we never contemplated, never wrapped our head around. I think that's the only way you get it done. David Sirota, who's on one of Sanders' senior advisors, talks about how Obama came in with this combination of like an actual movement with lots of energy and like all the Wall Street guys, right? And so what does he do? He gets into office, thank you very much movement. Right. Hello, Wall Street guys, welcome to the administration. And just completely disbands the movement. And it's probably, maybe the greatest, certainly the greatest initial error that he ever made. Sanders obviously would do the exact opposite.
Yeah, you have to take the temperature of the United States on the beautiful morning of whatever, I don't know when is it November 8th, 2000, did anyone know the election date? Anyway, sorry? November 3rd, so November 4th.
Sooner than we thought.
When we wake up to, and Cory Booker wakes up to his girlfriend Coffee, and Coffee tells him that Bernie Sanders is the next president of the United States. Sorry, that's a little, anyway. Just a little.
Wait, I'll punch it up for you. Yeah. And Rosario says, ha ha, but it's all right, don't worry about it.
There we go.
When that is coming, the temperature of the country. This is where I come back to the campaign, and I know I'm flogging this, but the situation. It's not just like we're swapping out the president now, and we have the media that we have now, and the party that we have now. We'll have a country in that moment that will have gone through something. That will have gone through Bernie somehow wresting the nomination away. We'll have gone through somehow, and we talk about a lot of the challenges. We haven't talked about the obstacles, the media obstacles, the corporate obstacles, the establishment obstacles, various other, torpedoes that he's going to have to dodge along that way. But if this has happened, he will have wrested the nomination away in June. He will have sort of seized the conch of the Democratic Party and have basically coerced a bunch of liberals who realize that he is, will have to bet on it, that he is the lesser evil than Trump. To support him in this campaign, and then, or at least not to actively oppose him in this campaign, and then he will have mobilized this vast. If he's going to win, especially in a general, it's going to be involved mobilizing a huge turnout, And then that movement will sweep him to power. So it will be a continuation of this. We're not like, okay, he has to, it's just, we're just putting him in with the blob as is. The blob will already, as Krystal says, already will be quivering in and trying to make sense of this crazy 6 months that has drowned it. And I think that's where, the permanent campaign, just continues. And you use the presidency, you can do things with the presidency, as I think, Megan Day and others have pointed out in the last issue, the other issue of Jacobin. You can do things like populist grandstanding, like, hey, guess what? Private prisons are over. The federal government's not going to support them. Or, okay, maybe that's a little more niche, but like, okay, guess what? The federal government will not be supporting, student loan profiteers anymore. Boom.
The
over.
new host
Executive
of Survivor
order.
Sucks.
Executive order. And you do that not just as a kind of like, here's a good, reasonable policy. You do that as I'm fighting for you. I am up here in the White House, but I am fighting for you with all of my governing power.
And I think as a serious point, and I don't know how you do this, you need to really start already disaggregating. I mean, look, a lot of people are just bad faith and not able to make this distinction, but explaining exactly how he would do that is different than Trump just like leaning on somebody for like a publicity announcement, right? Because that's how it's filtered as the same thing when you look at mainstream. Like Bernie Sanders says, hey, there's media monopolies, and that affects how they talk about income inequality. Well, of course, that's the same thing, obviously, as Trump like saying journalists should be locked up because they don't like his suit. And we need to be very aggressive on pushing back against that.
Yeah, although, I mean, honestly, when Trump was doing that grandstanding stuff, it was actually very effective.
Do you think that would be, that's a primary question, and I'm afraid that that's not as effective with Democrats as it is with Republicans. I think Republicans are totally enrolled.
They're down for it.
They are totally down for it.
I mean, look, I think if Bernie Sanders becomes president, if he just sits down with Mitch McConnell and they meet halfway, I think that's going to work out really well.
Wow. We don't have much time left, but before we break, and everybody, again, stay here, talk to each other, grab a beer, grab the Jacobin. It's a great new issue, as they always are. I want to ask you, Krystal, about Kentucky. What just happened there?
So it's such an important question, which I asked you to ask me, so thank you for that.
It's a little bit behind the third wall, folks.
Pulling the strings.
I like that. I remembered.
Here's what's so interesting. There's a lot that's interesting about Kentucky, and I admit I'm a little obsessed with this state. But 2015, before Trump, Matt Bevin, this total asshole,
Bad Matt.
businessman,
Very bad Matt.
Not a good guy.
runs this very sort of brash, anti-media, Trumpian type campaign. And again, people think of Kentucky as a red state. Kentucky's a very populist state. The politics there are complicated. You have a very pro-union, pro-labor, populist state. And Bevin runs literally on rolling back the Medicaid expansion, but people are just so disgusted with the like sort of normal way of doing things, and they have their elections in these off years. The turnout was super low. He upends the polls. He was down 10 points in the public polls and in the internal polls of both the campaigns. He ends up winning by 10, so a 20-point shift from what the poll said. He ends up winning and just totally stuns everybody there. And it really was kind of a canary in the coal mine for Trump, because they do have this similar like brash asshole approach to politics. But so when he gets into government, though, he makes good on this very right-wing economic conservative agenda, right to work, prevailing wage, all these, going after teachers' pensions, sparked a massive teachers movement in the state that shut down schools. Then he was an asshole to the teachers and said, basically accused them of, I'm not kidding, of being accessories to sexual assault. Insane, right? And Democrats...
That was for going on strike, right?
Right, for going on strike. Some child was sexually abused. He claims, this didn't even really happen, but he claims that teachers were accessories to sexual abuse because they went on strike. So state does not love this guy, right? He's terrible. And he's terrible to the press in the same way that Trump is. Fake news, he won't talk to him. He's corrupt. bad business dealings, all this stuff. And so as opposed to the National Democrats who have come at Trump with these sort of esoteric, the Ukraine stuff and obstruction of justice, and he shouldn't have told Jeff Sessions this when he went to Comey and that he asked him to do whatever.
Can we just, in this interest of fairness, give Donald Trump a lot of props for his Jeff Sessions impression? That's one of the funniest things I've ever heard in my life. Look it up.
Can you impersonate Donald Trump impersonating Jeff Sessions?
The context is that Donald Trump had furiously denied that he called Jeff Sessions a dumb Southerner. And he put out a tweet where he's like, I never said that. Being from the South is great, by the way. And then a month later, he was at CPAC, and he's just like, and he recuses himself. And he goes, I'm going to recuse myself. I watched that on repeat literally 20 times. Okay.
Anyway, so rather than running on these esoteric, always breaking the norms and guardrails, the norms, everybody loves the norms, right? He's breaking the norms or the high-minded principle, which is important. I'm part of the press, but the attack on the free press. No, they focused like a laser on labor rights, on teachers, and on healthcare. It was not complicated. And I got to tell you, I say this with love. Kentucky is a small state when you're in the Democratic Party. I know Andy Beshear, very nice guy, very not charismatic, right? This is not like a political powerhouse kind of a guy, but they were very, very disciplined, and they ran an excellent ground game. And most interestingly, yes, they did great in the suburbs and the areas where Democrats are doing well in most places in the country, but the reason they won is because they won back parts of coal country. That message of economic populism, labor rights, teachers, healthcare, over and over and over again, started to win back coal country. And I think as a movement, we have to have our sights set beyond the swing states of 2020. We got to do first things first, right? But what I took from Kentucky is that this type of politics, and what I took from West Virginia when I did work there as well and was there in the state during the teachers movement as well, is that over time, this type of politics can win back the trust of so many places where progressives used to routinely win and build back an actual sustainable majority for working class people. So I found the results there in Kentucky incredibly encouraging for that reason.
Can I just pump the issue one more time?
Gotta be quick.
Yeah, just quick.
No, I'm just playing. Go ahead. Take
just to bump the issue before we go. It's a serious intellectual wrestling match with the meaning of populism. There's also a lot of fun stuff in here. Conor Kilpatrick sat down with Adam McKay, who I didn't realize had a real left populist streak going all the way back to Talladega Nights. And seriously, for serious. Read it; it's there, and especially in the Mark Wahlberg vehicle, The Other Guys. Anyway, there was like a Derek Jeter anti-capitalist cameo that got hit the cutting room floor in that interview. Anyway, a lot of good stuff on culture, on interview stuff, profile on Ken Loach, Britain's great populist filmmaker, stuff on country music and Preston Sturges and left culture. I think that is going to play the sort of a cultural apparatus of a workers' movement is something that we're still really lacking right now.
Yeah,
but that's something that can catch up, and I think it might. There are some signs in Hollywood and far from Hollywood that this could make a comeback. That would be an important part of a Sanders era movement. Anyway, a lot of good stuff. Buy this issue, read this issue, put it under your pillow at night.
Okay, one more thought. Are we wrapping up? Okay, for those of you who watch Rising, I just want you guys to know how much I appreciate you, how much Saagar appreciates you. I have to tell you, we just started putting the show on YouTube in June. The growth and the response to it has been really incredible, and it's made me feel, it really has been heartening. I felt kind of alone, like, am I crazy thinking about things the way that I do? And for those of you who are out there watching the show and enjoying it and supporting what we're doing, it really, really means a lot. I think it's very exciting. I think it's, an exciting indicator of the type of things that we'll be able to build. So I just want you to know how much I truly appreciate it. Thank you. And Can we do the really stupid, goofy, like Ellen selfie of the whole room thing? Are you guys okay with that? Yeah. Like, can we do that? Because Saagar would be very excited to see that. Can we do it?
Yeah, let's do it. Wait, how do
Here's how we do it.
Okay.
All right.
I don't know, Ellen. Okay.
Oh my God.
Yeah, like this.
Do the high hope stand.
Oh yeah, high hope.
Thank you guys for humoring that.
Can you delete that immediately?
Yeah. It's already on Instagram.
Guys, I
Sorry.
appreciate all of you so much. Matt Karp is amazing. I love having him on my show and talking with him. The Jacobin is indispensable. Starting to do work in collaborations with Krystal has been one of the most fun things that I've done in the last several months. Thank you to Verso Books. Thank you to Jacobin. Stick around, buy issues, talk to each other. Thank you for doing the sound. Much appreciated, man.
Circulate.
Thank you.